Over the years, Firelight Media's Beyond Resilience series has become the premier space for BIPOC filmmakers to discuss the most pressing issues in the documentary field today.
When times are bad, BIPOC stories, BIPOC filmmakers are often the ones that are disproportionately affected. And I think that's happening now.
It's an award-winning program that filmmakers and industry leaders use to advocate for a healthier, more equitable documentary ecosystem.
We still don't have enough representation out there. So if I stop making films about Chinatown, if I stop making films about our community, who's going to make them?
Where are the equity frameworks that will keep curators from making harmful programming choices?
And crucially, it's where we say the quiet part out loud.
I think that is the part of the violence of the model minority shit, that it shaves away our history of resistance, of rebellion, of ferocity.
For stories about marginalized communities, there's this unbelievable pressure to make it relatable. And there's a weaponization of that word, I think, of what relatable actually means to whom.
So make sure to join us for Beyond Resilience events throughout our 25th year and beyond.
Let's turn to money for a second.
Somebody else take that question.
I'm going to take this one for the team, y'all.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Loira Limbal, President and CEO of Firelight Media. My pronouns are she, her, hers. Thank you for joining us today for our virtual Beyond Resilience conversation with Minnesota-based filmmakers. Grieve, Tend, Grow. I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement to raise awareness of Indigenous presence and land rights, and to stand in solidarity with Indigenous people. I'm calling in from Washington, D.C. today, the land of the Nacotchtank, Piscataway, and Pamunkey peoples. I encourage you to make your own land acknowledgement in the chat. Our chat moderator will drop a link to a resource that will help you discover whose ancestral lands you live on. In mid-December, the U.S. federal government began an operation ostensibly about immigration enforcement that would terrorize our friends and neighbors in Minnesota for months to come. As the world watched in horror as federal agents unleashed violence, chaos, and death on the streets of American cities, residents of Minnesota, including and especially filmmakers, hit the streets in defense of their communities. Local grassroots community organizing in Minnesota once again became the blueprint for people across the U.S. fighting authoritarian forces in their communities. Filmmakers in Minnesota and elsewhere continue to document, dissect, and disseminate what happened there, what is happening there, so that we may learn from those actions and preserve them for posterity. We're grateful to the filmmakers who join us today for this conversation, and to all of you in our virtual audience for joining us. Before I introduce today's moderator, I want to give a huge thanks to some folks behind the scenes. Thank you to Lou Mukherjee, Firelight's Documentary Lab Director, for putting together this event and for working with me to lead our Beyond Resilience series. And thank you to Jerónimo Saldaña, our technical producer, who has been supporting this program for many years now. Now I'll introduce the moderator for today's conversation, Nell Lawrence-Wareham. Nell serves as the Deputy Director of Explore Minnesota Film. She is a distinguished leader in the documentary field, having designed and led celebrated fellowship programs and artist initiatives that foster innovation, support creative and professional growth, and enhance industry investment in the future of arts, entertainment, and culture. Nell is also a longtime collaborator and friend to Firelight Media, and so we're grateful to have her here convening these filmmakers for today's conversation to tell us about what is happening on the ground in Minnesota. Thank you again for joining us today. Now please join me in welcoming Nell, who will introduce today's panelists.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you everyone for being here. Good afternoon. My name is Nell Lawrence-Wareham, and it's an honor to welcome you to this conversation hosted by Firelight Media. I'm grateful to be here in community with all of you, and especially the artists who are joining me today on this panel, Tahiel Jimenez Medina, Joua Lee Grande, and Lorenzo Serna, three extraordinary storytellers, all based here in the Twin Cities, whose work continues to deepen and challenge the way that we see this place that we call home. This afternoon, we're gathering around themes that are especially present in Minnesota right now: processing grief, tending to our community, and how the events this winter have reshaped not only our daily lives, but the stories we tell and the ways that we create, revealing both fragility and resilience. I have the privilege of seeing the many ways that Minnesotans show up for each other on sets, in neighborhoods, across cultures and creative traditions. What Firelight Media creates is often a space for artists of color to speak for themselves, to support one another, and to shape new futures in the way that they gather in the present. And it feels essential in this moment. While I'm here this evening, outside of my official capacity, I just want to say that it's really a privilege to be someone that gets to call Minnesota home. And I'm really happy to be here and to be with all of you. And I'm excited for us to dive in. So I'm going to kick us off by asking our panelists to please introduce themselves and ask them what their community care has looked like for you. Where are you seeing people step up for one another? And I'm going to ask Joua to start.
Hey everyone, my name is Joua Lee Grande, a doc filmmaker based here in the Twin Cities. And community care has been a lot of folks coming together and getting to work, whether or not we have the resources. A lot of people have pitched in to fill in the gaps where they see it and to check in on one another and to make sure everyone's taken care of as best they can be.
Thank you. I'm going to pass it over to Tahiel.
Hi everyone, my name is Tahiel, use he, pronouns. I am an independent filmmaker based in Minnesota, also the founder of Mama Papaya, an organization dedicated to nurture and cultivate cutie BIPOC filmmakers. I think the question of collective care has been really present for me in the way that people have been very neighborly during this process. People have been able to like meet people who they ne necessarily wouldn't get to know. So I've seen a lot of my friends and people who've been organizing, going door to door and connecting with each other. And I think this crisis has brought us, has made us more resilient and stronger.
Thank you. Lorenzo, go for it.
All right, what's up, everyone? This is Lorenzo Serna, pronouns they, them, Chicane. I'm here in Minneapolis, Dakota Territory, media maker, filmmaker, neighbor, I don't know, homie. And community care-wise, I think, I mean, I agree with what everyone's saying. I think it's just, what I saw a lot of is just people were suddenly willing to take risks that they weren't before for each other. And doing that kind of made another world possible for each other. And I think that that's really what is kind of where we're in this process now of like examining and understanding what those risks really were, I think with the aftermath of that escalation. And so I think, yeah, I think care in a lot of ways just turned into being willing to be part of the community and the risk that takes, and accountability that creates that didn't really exist there before. I think mostly society drives us further and further to being individuals and not connected to each other. There was just this moment where suddenly everyone came out and was like, oh yeah, actually I live next to you and I care about you. That's wild. And people took risks for each other that they just wouldn't have before, I don't think.
Thank you. That's beautiful. I was thinking actually about trying to do this panel today outside from my garden, but the light kept shifting, but I just wanted to sort of ground us in sort of the birds and bees and sounds of this place and this moment. It's a moment when Minnesota's kind of waking back up. There's little flowers and there's also sort of like dead things hanging on the trees, and it's both. It's the cycle, and it's been beautiful to see people kind of like come out and do their yard waste and wave at people and kind of just like reemerge and explore what it means to reemerge and be here in the spring with everything that has happened. For so many in this community, the events of this winter were enormously challenging. In filmmaking, how do you discern when to take action and pick up a camera? And also, how do you discern when it's best to cultivate pause? And a kind of follow-up to that question as well is, what does it mean to create films that respond to and work to reframe narratives while also maintaining integrity and care and cultural specificity? And I'll let whoever wants to just jump in.
No, like I'll just say, I mean, just like the first question, I'll just say like, I think during this last few months, like the community was moving so much and it was moving me. And so like, I feel like I constantly wanted to be holding the camera and I constantly found myself not holding the camera, you know, and doing other things that were helping people, with what they needed in the moment. And I think now I'm definitely in a time of like thinking through all of that of like how could I have moved a little differently, but also like what can be done now, and also like what I think in that process too. And I don't know, yeah, just that, just like I had owned a camera, I was out with a camera occasionally, but much more I was just like out keeping a lookout for folks and taking care of folks and doing what I felt was needed that would help someone else do what they needed to do, you know.
I will share, for transparency, that I was traveling for a couple of months during the last few months. So my perspective into what happened has really, I think, been unique. I saw the let up to the occupation, and I also returned a lot more rested than a lot of people are now after everything, and have been able to really witness and connect to people who I think just have a lot in their bodies after everything. And I think there's things that are not even like I think the community's still very much processing everything that happened. And just from talking to other filmmaker friends locally and people who have been more active on the ground, is that like what Lorenzo said, there was no time to record, there was no time to um, be pulling out a camera because it really like neighbors were being snatched from neighborhoods, and so people had to be very like radically like present and active in preventing those things from happening. And I think now there's a slowdown still continuing, and I think people are taking now the time to look at what was recorded and starting to like document those stories and start to process through film and also through relationships, the occupation.
Yeah, I think that here in Minnesota, it's pretty common that artists here are also very often activists and community organizers. And so most of the time, we're showing up as community members first and serving the community first. So many of us, especially BIPOC folks, we're not thinking, oh, is this a film opportunity? Is this like time to turn on the camera? We're thinking, what does our community need? And where can we fill in the gaps and where can we support? And so I think a lot of folks, a lot of filmmakers, that's where they turn to first. How can we serve? We're in a crisis, an emergency. How do we show up? And only when they're seeing how bringing a camera around would be beneficial might they turn it on. Like if the community is asking for it. And at the same time, the Twin Cities here, there's a big distrust in the community with mainstream media at this point, and especially anyone coming around putting a camera in people's faces. And at times it's necessary and helpful to get the word out there, and at times it's harmful. And so I think those who are local have a better understanding of how to do that with more thoughtfulness now, and especially because we saw it during the uprisings, how that played out for us locally. And I think people are a little bit more aware about how to do it better this time around. And that's not necessarily true for everyone, but so yeah.
I'll also jump in and say that I think the situation is very delicate in how we tell the stories that of the people who are being primarily targeted right now, which are undocumented immigrants. And so I think there's a big question around like visibility of these stories, but also how that visibility could be a danger to the people who are being portrayed. And it's, I think it's the task of filmmakers and artists to find creative pathways to archive what is happening and also at the same time protect the lives of people and um yeah, not extract their stories for selfish reasons. And yeah, it's I think there's so many stories. There were so many people who sheltered in, so many families and kids, like just the most like kind and beautiful and like yeah, just like wonderful people who had to be indoors for like months at a time without being able to go outside. Um, and how do you tell a person's story whose identity or like yeah, like identity markers could spotlight them for ICE? And also how do you humanize them and not just make them voices or you know, like generalize their experience. So I think there's a lot of nuance, and I think the next few months is really gonna show how filmmakers step into this moment and how they're able to not only make their art, but really care for the people who were affected during this occupation.
And I'll also add, I think that our community is very accustomed to being taken advantage of at this point by media. During the uprisings, we were very accustomed to folks coming into town and extracting and being harmful sometimes in the process, and leaving folks to deal with the aftermath of that, right? And so it's kind of like the delicate balance where the community wants our stories to be told to the world and also being like wants to make sure that like there's awareness over the actual impact and the implications over how the stories are told and how that leaves people exposed or the impact that leaves on the people whose stories are being shared. And that has not historically been thoughtfully considered by many. And so there's a big reason why, if you're actually on the ground, there are a lot of organizers who are very protective of the community. And so a lot of it has to do with trust and intention and making sure that like there are a lot of conversations around like how do we do this thoughtfully so that the impact is considered.
Yeah. Yeah, people don't trust the media. People don't trust people holding cameras, and so and also we're living in this society where people's lives are monetized for personal gain constantly. And so we have. I think that as filmmakers, we're faced with like how do we safely tell these stories and how do we do them with care to empower the communities to continue to like do what they need to do to survive and also to thrive, but also understanding that the long-term effects of everything we do are like being examined by oppositional forces who are against these communities. We can say it's like the state, the feds, like they want to criminalize, they want to target all these folks. And you have people who are very willing to just parachute into a situation, put cameras on, rapid responders, show them what they're doing, and then like be able to just go home and eat a meal and just like not worry about it, right? And like as somebody who lives in the community and like I can't personally be like, oh, I'm going to show everything about you because it's what's going to get me the most money from the internet. It's like it just doesn't work. And I think that's the thing that I'm constantly examining, but also like we need to be able to show people what we're doing. Like I think in the intro you said like, oh, people are looking at Minneapolis as a model of like what can be possible. What's like, well, we can't even talk about what happened because they'll allegedly criminalize all these people. So like, how are we even a model if we can't have a critical look at what people try to do in order to like get through this? And so I think that we're in a current like moment of like all these good questions and these good intersections of like thought that we have to figure out, because in the end what will happen and what did happen is like then other people are just going to tell the story of what happened in Minneapolis, be it like for a few days, for some little tour, and then they can go home and brag about it, but like in the end, like something I always talk about when I worked with a lot of journalists is like, you just remember you get to leave and you get to go home from your like experience, and people's lives are going to continue in that fashion. And it's the same thing that happened here. It's like our lives are continuing under this new occupation that's like it's shifted, like ICE is leaving the Whipple every day in convoys. Like they're still around. They just shifted what they're doing. And everyone else went home because it's not as exciting for them and it's not going to be as monetized for them. But we're still here, and we still have to deal with the ramifications of what's happening in their community and also our involvement in trying to tell that story of what's happening in their community. Because putting people at risk isn't the goal ever, but also like people took risks and people deserve to know why they took those risks. Other people outside. So if they have to take those risks, they have some sort of inspiration of where to ride or like, of a line to follow, And it's like we're facing a really hard moment of like how do we navigate that, knowing that there's all these tools who are literally like probably watching this and be like, what can we find to like tie together another little string of knots that we can say was a criminal endeavor. It's a really difficult moment, I think.
I also want to say and reiterate what you said. Like, I think there were so many things happening here in the Twin Cities that should be shared, like models that were created, organizing systems, messaging systems, of hyper-local organizing systems that I think are very revolutionary and could be adapted to various different things in the future. And I hope like those stories are told, like stories of how people came together. Um, I have a neighbor who before she's an immigrant, and before this all happened, she like hated Minnesota, didn't want to be here, and she lives right by Powderhorn, and she was a first eyewitness to all the protests at Powderhorn, how people came together, the amount of grocery runs, the amount of mutual aid. And now she's like, I can't leave Minnesota. Like this community is so powerful. And I think we share the horrible things that happen, but also how this has transformed yeah, people's lives as well and strengthened us.
Yeah, I would completely agree. I feel like during the George Floyd uprisings and during this occupation, there have been so many beautiful things happening in community that have never been fully shared with the world and the community outside of Minnesota because everything was happening on the ground and no one's thinking about like, oh, let's capture what we're doing, right? And also protecting people's identities and et cetera. And so there's still so many stories that are left to be shared about like the powerful, beautiful work that has been done and how people are coming together and how organically it's happened. And also how so much of the systems that have been put in place during this occupation have been built on previous movements here in Minnesota.
Thank you. I feel like there's a lot we can dig into if you want to all explore like the way that you are reframing time, right? And kind of pushing against ideas of crisis to say like we've been here before. We were here 6 years ago. We've been here before in other moments. And then there's also the work that you all do as filmmakers to think about where do your stories begin and end, and how are you troubling the ways that a frame might be put onto a place or a community.
I mean, I'm thinking, like if it's the movement's always moving, and this was like an upswell. I think that like what happened in Minnesota was happening in Chicago, was happening in LA, was happening in Portland. Like it was like there was a thread of things heading this way. And thankfully, a lot of those organizers and folks were in conversation with people here, so people could take lessons and then develop them to something else. I think that's really important always to say that like what happened here wasn't like you couldn't be like, I can't believe they killed somebody here because they literally killed people in Chicago, shot people in Chicago, shot people in LA. It's like they're already shooting people before they got here. They were already doing this, and then it happened here in our own backyard. And then, so I don't know. I just want to say that. And I think, I'm definitely like thinking about film is like people are going to look back, and what are they going to look back to? And is it going to be, the very like well documented like folks like a rapid response, like somebody was saying earlier, like earlier, the folks who are sheltering in place? Is it going to be like the folks who are just like feeding people, the people who are walking people to school, the kids that are being like, we're asking people to walk into school, the schools who are asking people to just look out for the school. You know, it's like there's so many different things, and all of them are somehow like intertwined to be what really happened. At least for like that moment that you can talk about before somebody else is like, no, this is what happened. So I mean, I don't really know, but I think that like all of those stories, it's like not one of those things is the thing, you know? And I think that's trying to figure out how to like thread that through whatever comes out to show like all these different facets of what's going on, and like how much like care was really built into every moment. And you know, I always like people are walking other people's kids to school. Like I don't know, like that was like the world people like dreamed about 10 years ago in conversations. Like we're gonna the children are raised by the village. I'm like, well, here's the village. Turns out it was just like our block. Who knew, you know? And so I think like yeah, I don't really know what it's gonna look like, but I know that it's important that it takes into account the lead up to the moments that happen in Minneapolis too, you know, and then the lead out, you know, because I think I'm always worried that people will look at what happened in the Twin Cities and in the area and be like, oh, like this is where it happened. It's like, no, it was like literally happening before. Like people were warning us from other cities, homies. Like they're like, watch out, this is coming your way. And then we're like, watch out, this is coming your way when I got here, you know? And so I think just trying to make sure that we include that like a movement moved here and that ignited here as well, and it kept going, you know. And I always think that's really important because I think that we get stuck in sort of like making our thing that we're part of the most important when it was just like part of the thing that's most important. It's like the path to liberation or whatever, you know.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of people are trying to imagine how we share these stories, and I imagine this is happening in all the other cities that are being heavily impacted too. But like, how do we share these stories in a way that can really be drawing to what's happening locally, but also pulling from what's happening nationally, um, and in a way that's like creative and sharing these stories that in a way that protects people. And people are being very imaginative and creative, and so I'm actually pretty excited to see how artists and filmmakers are able to share these stories in collaboration with community and in a way that's artful and non-traditional, because that's how a lot of these stories are going to be shared, I believe.
Yeah, Nell, you mentioned time, and I think it also connects to what Joua and Lorenzo mentioned. I think this, like, how do you capture time? And it makes me think about the non-linearity of the immigrant experience and also how people's time is exploited in this country. I just think about, yeah, I think, I had a conversation with someone who was sheltering in place, and she was telling me about how, she came from Ecuador, and then she, like, brought her kids through, she paid for them to travel all the way from Ecuador here on foot. Right. And then they finally were together, they're building a home, and all of a sudden this government decides that everything that they've been working towards and been building is not worth anything, and it can be absorbed from them. Um, and then I think about how time must have felt being sheltered in place for 2 months. So I think there's a lot of different directions in which filmmakers could creatively tell those stories, and the nonlinearity aspect of just living in a world where like a paper could define if you're legal or not, which I think is such an absurd concept to even think about, to call anybody like not legal, a friend, a neighbor, and their contributions to this country. And so, yeah, time feels really strange when you're an immigrant, I think. And I'm really curious to how filmmakers will creatively represent those shifts in time, the intensity of the occupation, how people came together, the sheltering in place, and yeah, all those dimensions of these recent times. Mhm.
Yeah, I'm definitely also thinking about like how ICE was already here right before January, and we already were seeing the impact and the stories, and the community organizers, anyways, were already hearing their experiences, folks who are being detained and then deported, and how their experiences are back in their original countries. Um, and so then, like, I'm super curious to like, I think that filmmakers are going to have a lot to be able to share with like the time, and that like as I know that organizers here on the ground, as they're supporting folks who've been detained or folks who are at risk, are already thinking about like, oh, what's it going to look like for you when you're sent back to your original country? Because we know that based on this, and that now. And how do you share those stories simultaneously across some time? And then on top of that, like deportation has been an issue way before the past year, you know? And how do you share those stories and connect it to an issue that's already been around for many years?
Yeah, absolutely. I also think about all the stories that um, are very hard to tell and may never be told. Like, for example, people who have gone through the process of being abducted and have been in these detention centers, which, from the little that, you know, I've been told, it's the most horrendous experience. Like, you're being barely fed during the day, you're sleeping in a room with tons of people, you're given a foil blanket. And so I think there's an urgent need to like visualize what happened in those camps and what is happening in those camps right now.
Yeah, I know. It's like hearing that. I'm just always like, and this is like something I'm struggling with as somebody who's been making media around movement stuff for a long time. Is like, is that going to change anything? You know, like we know, like if anyone's been paying attention, we know that like kids were imprisoned in these camps during the Biden era. Kids died in these camps during the Biden era, right? And
Mm.
like when and it was well documented. Like the information came out, people could access it, and somehow it just continued and now accelerated in this like trajectory of escalation that has been like the colonial state or whatever you want to call it. And so it's like I want these stories to exist, but I also want to figure out like how do we get them to move us in the direction of the world we want versus being like, oh, now we know, like the genocide in Palestine. It's like, oh, everyone sees it every day. Like we know. Is knowing
Mm.
enough? Like what do we have to do next besides just knowing? It's like I feel like we're so aware of everything now, but yet it just continues, and I think that's like my
Mm.
every morning I wake up, I'm like, look at this terrible news. And so yeah, sorry about that. It's just like I just have a hard time trying to figure out like what can I do to like share a story or show a point of view that gets someone to be like, oh yeah, that is wrong. Like, oh, that shouldn't be happening. Let's change it. And I feel like sometimes it feels impossible because I'm like, we already know all this stuff, and it's like we already know. And so it's like, and my job is like, I'm gonna try to create some more knowing, and then
Mm.
together we're gonna figure this out. And I'm like, well, when's the figuring out gonna happen, homies? Like, we are here. I'm like, we're all in this together. Let's figure it out. And so yeah, so I think that like all those stories are, we can delve further into it. I think like prisons in general are pretty awful. Like it sounds like some prisons, like that exist already, and then when we have like concentration camps, it's like how do we keep like telling the stories, and where is the backstop of like then let's change the direction of where we're going, because like it just feels like we're constantly heading in that path, and no matter the next atrocity I see that's well documented, I'm like, oh shit, well that's too bad,
Mm.
all right, let's go on to the next thing. And that's like I don't want that anymore. I mean, that's where sorry, now I'm just like where I'm wrestling with like being a filmmaker, where it's like I want to like bring some joy and show the magic of what's actually happening. And this is the backdrop of the world we're already in, and this is the world that could be. And like let's figure that out. So I don't know. Sorry.
Yeah, I definitely think a lot about the impact that telling our stories could have on policies, et cetera, and knowing that, like, let's be real, that's going to take some time, regardless of what's happened. But sometimes it's enough to tell our stories for us, for our communities, for the sake that us telling our stories and having it witnessed, even if the only place that gets distributed is here in our own community, that's healing enough for us, and that's celebrating us, and that's valid and powerful. And I think that's like a challenge of like the media landscape, and that, like, do we need mainstream media to validify our stories to have it be viewed as important? No, like a lot of our storytelling can be just for the sake of us.
I appreciate that a lot. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Lorenzo, what you're just sharing reminds me of a question and an idea that I came across the other day. I don't know if you all are familiar with it. It's called the Through-topia, where it's basically to get to a utopia, you have to go through a place where not everything has been solved and there's still issues and relationships and questions. And, you know, some of what I felt like I saw in my neighborhood was a bit of that Through-topia, where I was so busy with my neighbors. I love them to death now, but we were having like weekly pizza parties and saunas and crying and knitting, and it was incredible. And like you said, it's like we can do this all the time. This doesn't cost us anything. It's just our time. It's our relationships. And the question I want to ask you all is, what is something that you want audiences to not only know, but to feel? I'll widen it to just even outside of, or bigger than just audiences, also your collaborators and the people that you work with to make your films. What do you want them to feel?
Yeah, I think in the process of thinking about what film could do or what impact it could have, I think we can also reimagine the process of film, and how the process of film could be healing or more, um, yeah, like bring us closer together, organize us closer. So much of film has been historically, well, in its very young history, it's been very white, and in most of that history, like equity has been very much in progress and still very much in progress. So I think we're still inventing what film could be and how we can use film to change how things are. Um, so I don't know. I think some of the values that have already been mentioned, just like care, um, equity, solidarity, how do we integrate that more into the process of filmmaking, especially when we're reinventing like the traditional models? And I think there's a lot of reinvention yet to happen. So in my case, I just hope that like filmmakers and audiences, like in the future, for film, yeah, that it's a process that brings us like closer together and strengthens us, that doesn't like burn us out or makes us want to move on from the medium. And on the other hand, I'll also say it's nice to take a break from film every so often and just like be in community or do a different piece of art and not always feel that film is the only pathway for solving yeah, everything that we're processing right now.
Yeah, I think I will add that I think for me, so I have been on the ground quite a bit. I'm no longer on the ground so much for the sake of healing and recovering, but I've been actually pretty disappointed in some of the folks from the media world, right? And then it's also not surprising because I saw this during the uprisings. And the one thing that I really hoped that like would have been learned by now, but we all know these things take a lot longer to learn, is the importance of like our responsibility as storytellers to approach these issues, especially during times of crisis, with way more thought and intention and care, and to not put just our careers first, and to actually put consideration into like how we move in communities while we're trying to share stories. Um, in a way that is like putting the community first. And so I definitely feel like it's always important to revisit that and to revisit one's values and how one wants to move in a community when they say that they're trying to help to tell a story that needs to be told. And then on top of that, one thing that I'd like to say to people is like, hey, we have filmmakers here. You know, we don't necessarily need filmmakers from outside of here to come tell our stories for us. We don't need that kind of help, right? And so there's a lot, there are a lot of super talented folks in regions that are not the coasts and the Twin Cities here and in other places that we have the skill and the ability to tell our own stories. We just need the support. And so one thing that I want to say is to like supporters and collaborators, like support local filmmakers to help tell those stories because they already have those relationships with the community and it's coming from a place of community as opposed to just extracting a story and getting a credit, you know, and it goes a longer way. And I feel like also when people are telling stories, uh, when they're in relation and actual community with the people they're telling stories about, like it's done with a lot more thought and intention.
Yeah. Thanks again. Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think that this like the community deserves to have a say in how they're represented. They get to have a voice in what's being made about them, and it isn't always about it's like showing up and extracting it and then like leaving. You know, I feel like that's been this model. It's really where everyone's just sort of like we're over you coming here with your camera, you folks. We don't know who you are. And so I don't know. So I really resonate with that, and I'm always just trying to like. I always tell people like I show up to places with a camera, but I never like use it. I'm just like carrying a camera around for a while. Like, hi, I live here, and like this is what I do. I love cameras. I have a camera. One day I'll film something, but not right now. I just have a camera attachment. Anyways, but and it's just like to build that in. Yeah, and I think this as far as like filmmaking, I think I'm just like always trying to like just trying to show what's possible, you know, like what people didn't know was possible became possible when they came together, and that's like my constant theme. Like, look what people did together. Like, they didn't even plan this, you know, and like now they're doing this together. That's so great, yay, you know. And like, I think I'm always just sort of trying to this show like that there really isn't anything impossible when people are coming together to figure it out, and they can figure it out, and they usually do. And maybe it's messy, like you were saying, like that you have to move through this mess of like humanity and humans and everyone's colliding and like having different opinions and people don't like certain flavors like everyone's different, you know. That's why we're so awesome. That's why humanity's so cool. It's like everyone's a giant mess and we get to be like be in it, and that's our community, and we can like make beautiful things together and out of that mess. And so I think that's what I'm always trying to figure out, you know. It's like how do I show whatever happened in a way that acknowledges that these are actual people who have like actual stakes in their lives, and that together they made this possibility possible, and here's what it looked like, at least from this one point of view, you know.
Yeah, and I would add to that. I feel like the experts of the community are the community members.
Yeah.
And so I know that like when we're doing especially doc film, sometimes we like to decide how their stories are told because we've done some research and yada yada yada. But like these are people who this is their lived experiences, these are their lives. And if they're telling us, no, actually this is how this plays out, like the importance of us as storytellers to be open to that and to be like, what is the story you want to tell? And what is the information that we don't know? Um, and and I think that that's like the challenge of like working in like storytelling, and you're working with funders who have deliverables, who have an expectation for the type of story you're trying to tell. And it's like you can go into a community hoping to tell a certain story, but if the story the community is offering is slightly different, I hope that like people are open to that. Um, yeah.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Um, I have so many questions, and I know that we might have some questions coming in from the chat. So I'll take one that I see here. The question is, what is the mood in the streets currently?
Yeah, I don't know because Lorenzo, you've been on the streets. I don't know if you've been lately. I have finally pulled back and I'm trying to rest and recover. But yeah, I don't know if you've been out.
No, I mean not. It's like the streets are so like I'm in the street every day, but I think that like people, it's always like a clash. As there's definitely people who are like, we won, you know, and then there's people like, wait, they're like, what happened? And it's like, well, what do we do with all this? Now that this crisis and this sort of like we need to respond to this visual threat is gone, but all this infrastructure was created, and it's like, how do we use this going forward? And I think that like so it's like a lot of questions. Like people are still moving, people I think are still trying to organize, but also acknowledging that like that fervor that was there when like everyone was openly being kidnapped, because like they're just like literally outside the door, like kicking doors in, is gone. Like that sort of like I think like push of everyone just being involved like is back, and I think that people are trying to also like process what happened, and be able to like have some sort of healing because it was just like an open wound for months, of like you can't sleep, you're worried about you're worried about all these weird things you never worried about before. Like my family had like goggles for our kids in case we got pepper sprayed, like the things that you were thinking about every day wasn't super healthy, so I think people are also trying to like figure out how to like move through that to like what is life like now after that experience, so I think the streets are always the streets. They're still there, they're variable, and they're going to change. People are continuing to try to figure out how to organize from that moment. People are falling out. People are trying to heal. Probably there's also probably a lot of confusion, of like what when you're also in a moment of very like activated space, and then that activation is gone. There's like that energy needs to go somewhere, and I think that people are also trying to provide healing spaces for that energy because it's also a very dangerous moment, when the drawback happens and suddenly like you have all these people who that knew what they were doing tomorrow, and suddenly that thing is gone because that visual threat that they were dealing with is also like gone, so they have to like adjust that. So I think there's like a lot of adjustments happening, and just healing going on, and people are trying to make spaces for that, and then also just like trying to figure out how do you continue to build infrastructure for whatever is going to come next and not let this sort of fade away, into just like, yay, I don't know, just fade away basically. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll also uh chime in that I it's like ICE isn't gone. There's still stuff happening all the time. It just looks different, and there's still a lot of organizing and stuff happening in the streets. It just looks different. Um, and I know that the last time that I tuned in, what it was looking like was that ICE was pulling out, but ICE is still here, right? They're still driving around, watching people, and the community has been adjusting how they do that because they're not as in your face anymore, but they're still around. And so community members are still going up to ICE vehicles and saying, "Who are you?" Identifying yourself, and all of that. And the strategy has changed. Unfortunately, local law enforcement has been doing the work of ICE instead, right? So, in some instances, like confronting protesters or activists on behalf of ICE. And so, yeah, ICE is still around, but they may not be like forefront so much, but there are people doing their bidding for them. And then on top of that, there's been a lot more bounty hunters who've been activated to do the work on behalf of ICE, which is scary because I don't know if anyone knows, my family has had experiences with aggressive and abusive bounty hunters. So I have some degree of experience that like it's like the Wild West. There are not really laws to like watch over bounty hunters the way that there are for even ICE agents or police, right? And so then they get away with a lot more, and and then they can do the work on behalf of ICE without ICE having to like get the flack for that, right? And the danger of that. And so I know that the community, last I checked, community organizers were trying to figure out how do we educate our community about how to respond to bounty hunters now. And so, and that work is always continuing, like as the occupation shifts in how it operates, the community shifts as well.
I would answer that question about how the streets look, and say that it depends on who you ask. I think it looks very different to everybody, and we probably would have to bring a big circle of people to even start to comprehend it. But what I can say is that I recently moved to Powderhorn like a year ago, which is a few blocks from where Renee Good was murdered and where Alex Preddy was murdered. So it's really the nucleus of where a lot of the organizing was happening on the abductions. And I left in December and then came back about a month ago. And what has been really healing for me as an immigrant, specifically like a Latina immigrant, was walking to Powderhorn and just in the afternoons you just see so many beautiful like brown immigrants like just playing volleyball, little like the cutest little kids running around. It really is like the most for me one of the most amazing places to be. It just feels so lively. And so coming back, I was really worried that I was gonna walk this park and I was gonna not see that anymore, and it was gonna be like a haunting silence. Um, but even now, like I've been walking around as spring is coming, and there's no, people are going out. There's kids still. It's really, really beautiful that I know that there's been a lot of abductions, and the community has been through so much, but I want to say that many of us are still here and many people are still going out and like living their lives. And it's yeah, just really beautiful to see that as well.
Yeah, I would agree. I think there's like a bittersweetness to what's happening in the streets. In terms of like the last time I went to a park with my kiddo, it was so beautiful to finally see Black and brown folks like actually out and feeling like safer and like walking around and having their children play and laugh. And that like our streets have been empty for so long. And like to see that was so joyful and wonderful and beautiful. And also to know that like the folks who have been out in the streets and protesting and like fighting back are at this point, like many of folks are pulling back to focus on their mental health. And what I know from the George Floyd uprisings is that the folks who are on the streets the most, fighting the most for people's lives, once they got to pull back and rest, that's when the trauma hits the hardest. That's when the depression hits the hardest. And I believe that that's what's happening now as folks are able to finally pull back a little, rest more, that folks are struggling and they're trying to heal. And so it's like a very bittersweet kind of thing.
Yeah, like if you out there and you got friends here in Minneapolis, call them up. Just check on them. You know what I'm saying? Don't wait for a text. Don't wait for them to get a hold of you. They're not going to. Once you got that really resilient friend, who's like, oh, I can, just like, I was always the one who's like, you gotta take care of yourself, like more than likely they're not doing it for themselves, So like, yeah, let's reach out. It's a super dangerous time, after this. It's a dangerous time. I can go this like update. This is a very dangerous time after like a giant upswell. So I'm glad you mentioned that. And people are trying to heal and be willing to help them out, like just
Yeah.
call them up. Don't just don't wait for them to get a hold of you.
Yeah. Also, just from the Minnesota perspective, I think we're all really excited for spring and summer, and I think hopefully as things continue and we continue to stay like connected and activated, we also are able to like move our bodies more because it's harder in the winter to be to just like release some of that stress and that tension. So I hope we can just go outside to the park and like lay on the grass and like shake our bodies and do different things, which can be really hard to do in the winter months here.
I was at a lecture recently where one of the panelists was saying that I wish that there had been space and time for us to dance and sort of be with one another and move and remember why we're doing this, right? Being together. So thank you. Okay, I see another question in the chat. It's a little long, so bear with me. I think this question is for everyone, but for Joua in particular. It asks, could you please speak to the Southeast Asian American experience in Minnesota as much as any one person reasonably can? What you're seeing on the ground within Minnesotan Asian American communities. I think this context matters so much because of the lived experience of this community can often be quite different from other parts of the country. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. there's more that we can follow up on. But yeah, Joua,
Yeah.
anything you want to share?
Yeah, like I feel like Southeast Asians in general, we're still pretty invisible from the media. I know here in Minnesota, even to become visible to our own local government took a lot of community organizing to like separate the East Asian experience from the Southeast Asian experience because we have completely different peoples and we have completely different experiences. And so there's this assumption that like, oh, Asians aren't being targeted, or if they are, it's like not really a big thing. But um, for Southeast Asians, we're a huge target for ICE when ICE was here, right there. And there was already things being in the works with this administration to work with those governments or force those governments to take deportees because a lot of the reasons why, like Khmer people, Cambodian folks had they've been getting deported for the past decade or so, right? But everyone else, because those countries would not receive it, like for example, I am Hmong and my parents are from Laos, and Laos was not receiving, they're refusing to receive deportees, or they're receiving really few. And in June is when they were kind of strong-armed into receiving more. And so detainment of Southeast Asians has like increased a lot. And so like when ICE was here, they were definitely targeting like Hmong folks because we have the largest Hmong community in the US here in the Twin Cities. And they're targeting Lao, Vietnamese, and Khmer folks, and it was very invisible in the media. Like in mainstream media, it was invisible, the stories weren't being shared. And in part, the community was scared. They didn't want the attention on us. And we also see our Somali siblings, they're being heavily attacked in the media. And I imagine it's like this Southeast Asian community being like, oh, do we want to be in the media? We don't want to, like, not only are they being, like, they're being highlighted in the media so much, we have right-wingers, like influencers flying into town and like harassing the Somali community. Do we want that? And so there's been so much harm that's been done to Southeast Asians here, but people are afraid and aren't really sharing the stories. And then also like organizers know that like we need the support, but we don't want to put a target on our backs. So how do we do this quietly? And how much of our stories do we share because we need the world to know, but also how do we protect ourselves? And I think it was just by coincidence that in January, the first Hmong mayor was elected in Minnesota. And so essentially Renee Good was murdered days into her being in office. And I think that she's sort of tried to use her platform to educate people that, oh, my Hmong community is being targeted too. And so oftentimes it's been just her. And then there was an elder who was also detained in his boxers. Those were really the only two stories that were making it out there. But there were so many other stories that like Hmong folks within our community were sharing amongst ourselves, but weren't being picked up as much. And I think over time, as people slowly started figuring out that like, oh, like Southeast Asians are a big target, it's been covered a little more, but there's still so much that's happened that hasn't been shared.
Thank you. All right, I think this will be our last question. For everyone on the panel, what is some advice for upcoming filmmakers, folks who might be watching, who do want to get involved and be helpful? If there are tips or resources, things that you would say, this is a really good way for you to get involved. This we don't need as much. I think that'd be helpful for everyone on the call today.
Well, I think the first thing that I would say is try and get connected with like grassroots independent filmmakers in town. I would say you can connect with Mama Papaya, our organization. We have like events coming up to connect with each other. I would also say, yeah, just try and meet like filmmakers who you want to connect with, public functionaries having some events coming up in the near future in Minnesota. And or like wherever you live, I would just say like start with relationships and community and go from there. I think that's always just a great way to get started and get a sense of like what's happening in the ecosystem already.
I think I kind of, I think I'm gonna repeat myself from something I just said, but like I think just like don't worry about it as much. I think that like we're at least in like some of the circles I came up when I was younger, is like we're supposed to have the answers and we're supposed to know. We're like, if you're like brought up as like a dude, you're supposed to like be like the first to the get. Like you're supposed to know everything, and like we don't know everything, and that's okay. Let's go with that, And I think just try to be present in spaces where people are interested in the things you're interested in, and don't try to be present as a person who's like, oh, I'm going to provide all the answers, but like be curious and willing to learn from each other, and like that is a good way of showing up. Just like be present. Don't worry about all the right things because you don't know the right things, and I don't either. It's like I'm just like share space with people and try to like build relationships with people who are interested around the same things, and like you'll share this world that you want to talk about and probably document. And then like through that process of learning about each other, you'll figure out that avenue that makes sense, and that feels like you can talk about it, And I think yeah, don't worry about questioning so much and just be okay with the not knowing and go be present in something,
Yeah, I think I would agree, just openness and connection and being a community. And I would second connecting with Tahiel and Mama Papaya, which they're such huge supporters of BIPOC and immigrant filmmakers here in town, and other small organizations here are as well. And I think just being in community and learning slowly like how to be a support to people and how to just uplift people.
All right. Well, I think we will pause here. Tahiel, Joua, Lorenzo, thank you all for joining us this afternoon, and thank you to everyone online for being with us. And I hope that you will all come to Minnesota, connect with these filmmakers, be a part of our community. We'd love to keep the conversation going. So thank you. And thank you to Firelight and to all the staff and everyone behind